All the wrong lessons. Inside the mind of the blue leftist. Well, the election is over. The Zero Seats campaign was, unfortunately, a failure. Despite truly massive losses on the part of the Tories, they did, in the end, manage to cling on to more than 100 seats, 121 in fact. Although such massive losses are a welcome development, they do represent something of a problem for those of us on the right wing who had hoped for total Tory death. The MPs retained by the Tories, largely those on the wetter end of Conservative politics, will endeavour to place obstacles in the way of the growing, genuinely right-wing momentum in our country, and ensure that the Overton window not be allowed to shift too much in a rightward, extreme, or Farageist direction. Already we see the damage control on the part of left-wing Tories determined, inexplicably, not to let their party's recalibration take on a more reactionary form. As an example, Rory Stewart, that ugly toad who perfectly epitomises what I would term blue leftism in this country, has stated that, quote, "The only way that the Conservatives will ever be in government again is by moving back to the centre and rejecting the fantasies of the Farageist right. But it will be a painful fight with many party members who will insist that moderation, prudence and realism is wet." Unquote. It is utterly impossible to comprehend the logic of the blue leftist. After an election in which the plucky populist newcomer Reform claimed over 4 million votes, only 2 million fewer than the Tories, ensuring their crushing defeat, an election in which the failure of mass immigration had been front and centre of the national debate, and an election which took place amidst a palpable rightward shift on the continent, calls for business-as-usual national decline are unforgivably misguided. The hand-wringing, spineless, tepid insistence on moderation, despite the repeated failures of the Conservatives to hold the centre, is a symptom of the barely disguised progressivism of the post-Cameron Tory party, and the post-Blair paradigm overall. Attempts to hold the centre constitute a resignation to the perceived forces of history, as they serve only to cement recent left-wing cultural gains. It is the sorcerer's apprentice attempting to stop the continued flooding armed with only a bucket, damage control, and never stopping to deal with the root problem, the source of the flooding itself. Left-wing cultural pressure can only be tamed by an equal, or ideally greater, countervailing right-wing pressure. The dialectical determination of cultural direction means that actual right-wing force is required to hold back and repel left-wing pressure. This is elementary stuff, a metaphysical reality which, in reasonable times, would be obvious to all. -5 plus 5 equals 0, while -5 plus 0 equals -5. A fire, in the absence of some form of retardant, will simply continue burning indefinitely and expanding. Placid calls for moderation are, to the ears of the leftist, tacit permission to push onwards. Stewart's moderation can only mean not rocking the boat, keeping the leftists happy, and maintaining the destructive status quo. His prudence can only mean refusing to stand by one's principles. His realism can only mean surrender to the forces of history. As fellow commentator Morgoth points out, 1 million immigrants in a year isn't some sort of kind, compassionate centre ground, it's treason. Stewart's political philosophy can be summarised thusly: the continuation of managed decline. His unthinking, reflexive assertion is that the remedy for the present situation is actually the extension and expansion of the Blairite deconstruction afflicting this once great country. He has abandoned the principles of conservatism, if indeed he ever actually held to them, in favour of the Blairite leprosy, the passive acceptance of ongoing national degradation. Frankly, it's revolting, and must be rejected wholesale. The Denethors, the Peter Hitchenses, and the Grima Wormtongues, the Rory Stewarts, of British politics must be cast aside as the useless obstacles they are. With all due respect to Hitchens for the great work he has done in recent decades, in purely Schmittian terms, he has become a political enemy at this point, no longer a friend. Doomerism and calls for conciliation with our political enemies are anathema to the revitalisation of our country, and must be left behind. While the decline will persist under this Labour government, we must not wallow in our displeasure, but prepare ourselves for the larger war which lies some years ahead. The battlefield must be selected and prepared in such a way that it favours our eventual victory. We are not the extremists. We are fighting back against the forces of extremism which have set the country down the path to terminal decline. The situation is, in fact, black and white. You are either actively opposed to this decline, or you are an enabler.